Question 1. The monitoring system demonstrates a recurring pattern of delays in client onboarding due to manual data verification steps. Which approach to process optimization is most aligned with regulatory expectations for efficiency in client service? Option A. Reducing the number of data points collected during onboarding to shorten the verification time, assuming clients will provide missing information if requested later. Option B. Expediting all manual verification steps by increasing the number of staff assigned to the onboarding team without altering the process itself. Option C. Implementing an automated data validation tool that cross-references client information against approved databases with a human review for flagged discrepancies. Option D. Delegating the entire onboarding process to an external vendor without establishing clear oversight or performance metrics. The correct answer is C. Implementing an automated data validation tool that cross-references client information against approved databases with a human review for flagged discrepancies. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the efficiency gains of process optimization with the imperative to maintain regulatory compliance and client trust. The core tension lies in identifying improvements that enhance operational effectiveness without compromising the integrity of client interactions or introducing new compliance risks. Careful judgment is required to discern genuine improvements from those that might inadvertently lead to breaches of conduct or regulatory scrutiny. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a systematic, data-driven, and compliant method for evaluating and implementing process changes. This involves understanding the current state, identifying specific pain points or inefficiencies, proposing targeted solutions, and rigorously testing these solutions against regulatory requirements and client impact. This methodical process ensures that any optimization efforts are not only effective, but also ethically sound and legally defensible, aligning with the principles of good conduct and client care expected within the regulatory framework. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on cost reduction without considering the impact on client service or regulatory adherence would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to a failure to meet regulatory obligations, such as those related to client suitability, record keeping, or fair treatment, potentially resulting in disciplinary action, fines, or reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that bypasses established review and approval processes for proposed changes, even if seemingly minor, undermines internal controls and increases the risk of unintended consequences or noncompliance. This disregards the importance of oversight and due diligence mandated by regulatory bodies to protect consumers and market integrity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the existing regulatory landscape and internal policies. When considering process optimization, they should ask, does this change enhance client outcomes or service quality? Does it maintain or improve compliance with all relevant regulations? Are there any potential ethical implications? What are the risks associated with this change, and how can they be mitigated? This structured approach, emphasizing a holistic view of efficiency, compliance, and client welfare, guides professionals toward making sound, responsible decisions. Question 2. The performance metrics show a consistent underperformance of a client's core investment portfolio over the last 2 quarters, leading to a decline in their overall wealth accumulation goal. How should an advisor proceed? Option A. Focus solely on the negative performance figures and suggest aggressive, high-risk strategies to quickly recoup losses, regardless of the client's stated risk appetite. Option B. Immediately recommend liquidating the underperforming assets to prevent further losses and reallocate funds to a perceived safer but potentially lower return investment class. Option C. Advise the client to simply wait and hope for market recovery, as short-term fluctuations are normal and any action could be detrimental. Option D. Initiate a detailed review of the client's financial objectives, risk tolerance, and the underlying reasons for the portfolio's performance, considering market conditions and the suitability of the current strategy before proposing any adjustments. The correct answer is D. Initiate a detailed review of the client's financial objectives, risk tolerance, and the underlying reasons for the portfolio's performance, considering market conditions and the suitability of the current strategy before proposing any adjustments. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs of a client with the long-term implications of their financial well-being and adherence to regulatory standards. The advisor must interpret performance metrics not just as data points, but as indicators of potential client behavior and suitability of current strategies. Careful judgment is required to avoid making reactive decisions that could harm the client or violate regulatory obligations. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a holistic understanding of the client's situation, aligning with the principles of client-centric advice and suitability. By engaging in a thorough review of the client's objectives, risk tolerance, and the performance metrics in context, the advisor demonstrates a commitment to acting in the client's best interest. This proactive and analytical approach is fundamental to maintaining client trust and fulfilling regulatory duties, such as those under the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, in the UK, which emphasizes treating customers fairly and ensuring that advice is suitable. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the negative performance metrics without considering the client's broader financial plan or risk tolerance would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to inappropriate recommendations, such as forcing a sale of assets at an inopportune time, potentially causing significant financial loss to the client, and violating the duty to provide suitable advice. Failure to consider the client's individual circumstances and objectives is a direct contravention of regulatory expectations. Another incorrect approach that involves immediately recommending a drastic change in investment strategy based on short-term fluctuations, without a comprehensive review, would also be ethically and regulatorily flawed. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and could be seen as a reactive, rather than a considered, response. It fails to acknowledge that investment performance can be cyclical and that short-term volatility is often inherent in markets. Such an approach could lead to unnecessary trading costs and a departure from a well-established, long-term investment plan, potentially breaching the principles of prudent investment management and suitability. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the client's objectives and risk profile. 2. Analyze performance data within the context of the client's overall financial plan and market conditions. 3. Identify potential deviations from expected outcomes and their root causes. 4. Engage in open communication with the client to discuss findings and potential adjustments. 5. Formulate recommendations that are suitable in the client's best interest and compliant with all relevant regulations. 6. Document all discussions and decisions thoroughly. Question 3. Market research demonstrates that clients often express a desire for investments that promise rapid and substantial returns. In such a situation, what is the most appropriate professional response for an advisor? Option A. Immediately present a range of high-return investment products that are currently popular, assuming the client's stated desire indicates a willingness to accept higher risk. Option B. Focus on investment products that offer the highest potential commission, as this indicates a strong market demand and likely client satisfaction. Option C. Engage in a detailed discussion to understand the client's overall financial goals, risk tolerance, and existing portfolio before suggesting any specific investment, even if it doesn't immediately align with the client's stated desire for rapid returns. Option D. Provide a simplified explanation of a few high-return products and encourage the client to invest quickly before market opportunities disappear. The correct answer is C. Engage in a detailed discussion to understand the client's overall financial goals, risk tolerance, and existing portfolio before suggesting any specific investment, even if it doesn't immediately align with the client's stated desire for rapid returns. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs of a client with the long-term implications of their financial decisions, all while adhering to regulatory requirements. The PI behavioral test in this context aims to assess an individual's ability to make sound judgments that align with ethical conduct and regulatory compliance, particularly concerning client suitability and responsible advice. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives before recommending any product. This aligns with the fundamental principles of client care and suitability, which are cornerstones of regulatory frameworks designed to protect investors. Specifically, it reflects the duty of care owed to clients, ensuring that recommendations are not only appropriate but also in the client's best interest, thereby avoiding potential conflicts of interest and upholding professional integrity. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's stated desire for a high-return product without adequate due diligence fails to meet the regulatory obligation to assess suitability. This could lead to the client investing in products that are too risky for their circumstances, potentially resulting in significant financial losses and regulatory breaches related to mis-selling or inadequate advice. Another incorrect approach that involves pushing a product based on its commission structure, rather than its suitability for the client, represents a clear conflict of interest and a violation of ethical standards. It prioritizes the advisor's gain over the client's welfare, which is strictly prohibited by regulatory bodies. A further incorrect approach that involves making assumptions about the client's understanding of complex financial products without verification is also professionally unacceptable. This can lead to the client making uninformed decisions, exposing them to undue risk and potentially violating disclosure requirements. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. First, gather comprehensive client information. Second, analyze this information to determine suitability. Third, identify appropriate products that meet the client's needs and risk profile. Fourth, clearly explain the risks and benefits of any recommended product. And finally, document the entire process to demonstrate compliance and sound judgment. This systematic approach ensures that advice is client-centric, compliant, and ethically sound. Question 4. Market research demonstrates that clients often express a strong preference for investments that have performed well recently, even if historical data suggests these are now overvalued. A financial advisor is meeting with a new client who has explicitly stated they want to invest heavily in a sector that has seen significant gains in the past year. The advisor suspects this preference might be influenced by recency bias and a desire to chase past performance. What is the most appropriate course of action for the advisor? Option A. Discuss the client's stated preference, explore the underlying reasons for their interest in the sector, and then present a diversified portfolio that includes the sector but also considers the client's long-term goals, risk tolerance, and broader market conditions, educating them on potential risks of concentrating investments based on recent performance. Option B. Immediately advise the client against investing in the sector, explaining that chasing past performance is a common mistake and that the advisor will only recommend investments with a proven long-term track record. Option C. Suggest a small speculative allocation to the sector, but primarily focus on investments with low volatility and consistent, albeit lower, returns, without delving into the client's specific interest in the high-performing sector. Option D. Allocate the majority of the client's funds to the sector the client has identified, as their stated preference should be the primary driver of investment decisions. The correct answer is A. Discuss the client's stated preference, explore the underlying reasons for their interest in the sector, and then present a diversified portfolio that includes the sector, but also considers the client's long-term goals, risk tolerance, and broader market conditions, educating them on potential risks of concentrating investments based on recent performance. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs and expectations of a client with the long-term implications of their investment strategy, all within the bounds of regulatory requirements. The challenge lies in identifying and addressing potential behavioral biases that could lead to suboptimal financial decisions, while ensuring that advice remains client-centric and compliant. Careful judgment is required to distinguish between genuine client preferences and decisions influenced by cognitive biases. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's financial situation, goals, and risk tolerance, and then actively seeks to identify and mitigate the impact of behavioral biases. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on acting in the client's best interest, providing suitable advice, and ensuring clients understand the risks involved. By using a structured process that probes beyond initial statements, the professional demonstrates a commitment to objective advice and client well-being, fulfilling their fiduciary duty and adhering to ethical standards that demand diligence and integrity. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's stated preference without further investigation fails to meet the regulatory requirement of providing suitable advice. It risks reinforcing a potentially detrimental behavioral bias, such as overconfidence or loss aversion, leading to an investment strategy that is not truly in the client's best long-term interest. This could be considered a failure to exercise due diligence and act with professional care. Another incorrect approach that dismisses the client's stated preference outright, without attempting to understand the underlying reasons or explore alternatives collaboratively, can damage the client relationship and may not be perceived as client-centric. While aiming to protect the client, can be seen as paternalistic and may not align with the principle of empowering clients to make informed decisions, even if those decisions require guidance. This could lead to a breach of trust and a failure to meet the client's perceived needs, even if the underlying intent is sound. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. 1. Understand the client's stated goals and preferences. 2. Probe deeper to uncover the rationale behind these preferences, looking for potential behavioral influences. 3. Educate the client about common behavioral biases and their potential impact on investment decisions. 4. Present a range of suitable options, clearly explaining the risks and benefits of each and how they align with the client's overall financial objectives. 5. Document the advice provided, including the rationale and any discussions about behavioral considerations. 6. Ensure the client understands and agrees with the chosen course of action, confirming it aligns with their best interests. Question 5. Compliance review shows that a long-term client, who has consistently expressed a conservative investment philosophy, is now requesting to liquidate a significant portion of their diversified portfolio to invest in a highly speculative, unproven asset class based on a recent social media trend. The client is adamant about proceeding immediately, citing a fear of missing out. Option A. Discuss the client's motivations for this sudden shift in investment strategy. Explain the inherent risks and volatility of the proposed asset class and present alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their established risk tolerance and long-term financial goals, while documenting the conversation and rationale. Option B. Proceed with the liquidation and investment, but only after obtaining a signed waiver from the client, acknowledging the speculative nature of the investment and their understanding of potential losses. Option C. Advise the client that their request is inconsistent with their previously stated conservative investment philosophy and refuse to facilitate the transaction without further justification from them. Option D. Immediately execute the liquidation and investment as requested by the client to avoid upsetting them and to capitalize on the perceived short-term opportunity. The correct answer is A. Discuss the client's motivations for this sudden shift in investment strategy, explain the inherent risks and volatility of the proposed asset class, and present alternative, more suitable investment options that align with their established risk tolerance and long-term financial goals, while documenting the conversation and rationale. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge in balancing the immediate needs of a client with the long-term implications of their financial decisions, particularly when those decisions might be influenced by emotional factors rather than objective analysis. The professional must navigate potential conflicts of interest and ensure advice aligns with regulatory expectations for suitability and client best interests, even when the client expresses strong, potentially misguided preferences. Difficulty lies in providing objective guidance without alienating the client or appearing dismissive of their concerns, while upholding professional standards. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates a commitment to the client's best interests and adherence to regulatory principles. By seeking to understand the underlying reasons for the client's request and exploring alternative solutions that achieve similar goals with less risk, the professional acts as a fiduciary. This involves educating the client about potential downsides, offering suitable alternatives, and documenting the rationale for any recommendation. This aligns with the regulatory framework's emphasis on suitability, client understanding, and acting with integrity, ensuring that advice is not only responsive to the client's stated desire, but also prudent and in their long-term financial well-being. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately fulfilling the client's request without further inquiry. This fails to meet the regulatory obligation to assess suitability and understand the client's objectives beyond their immediate stated desire. It risks facilitating a transaction that is not in the client's best interest, potentially leading to significant financial harm and regulatory scrutiny for failing to exercise due diligence. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright, without attempting to understand their motivations or explore alternatives. This can be perceived as patronizing and may damage the client relationship. Ethically, it fails to engage in a constructive dialogue to guide the client towards a more appropriate solution, potentially leading to the client seeking advice elsewhere or proceeding with a suboptimal plan without professional guidance. A third incorrect approach might be to focus solely on the potential commission or fees associated with the client's preferred course of action, rather than the client's welfare. This represents a clear conflict of interest and a breach of ethical duties, prioritizing personal gain over the client's best interests, which is strictly prohibited by regulatory bodies. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a client-centric approach, beginning with active listening to understand the client's underlying needs and concerns. This should be followed by a thorough assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and objectives. When a client expresses a specific preference, the professional's role is to educate them on the implications of that preference, explore suitable alternatives, and collaboratively arrive at a decision that is both aligned with the client's goals and compliant with regulatory requirements. Documentation of the entire process, including discussions and rationale, is crucial for demonstrating adherence to professional standards and regulatory obligations. Question 6. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a client, who has recently experienced a significant market downturn affecting their portfolio, is expressing strong emotions and a desire to make drastic, immediate changes to their investments to recover perceived losses. They are specifically asking to liquidate a substantial portion of their holdings in a relatively stable, long-term growth fund to reinvest in a highly speculative, volatile asset class they believe will offer rapid returns. What is the most appropriate course of action for the financial professional in this situation? Option A. Immediately liquidate the client's holdings in the stable growth fund and reinvest in the speculative asset class as requested to demonstrate responsiveness to the client's immediate concerns and desire for action. Option B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for their emotional response, review their overall financial goals and risk tolerance, and explain the potential risks and suitability of the proposed speculative investment in the context of their long-term plan before making any recommendations. Option C. Focus solely on the potential for high returns from the speculative asset class, highlighting the possibility of rapid recovery and downplaying the associated risks to satisfy the client's immediate desire for action. Option D. Inform the client that their request is too risky and refuse to discuss any further investment options, advising them to wait until their emotions have settled. Correct answer is B. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the underlying reasons for their emotional response, review their overall financial goals and risk tolerance, and explain the potential risks and suitability of the proposed speculative investment in the context of their long-term plan before making any recommendations. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs of a client with the long-term implications of their financial decisions and the firm's regulatory obligations. The client's emotional state and desire for quick action can create pressure to deviate from sound financial planning and regulatory compliance. The professional must navigate this by remaining objective, adhering to established procedures, and prioritizing the client's best interests within the regulatory framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach demonstrates a commitment to the client's overall financial well-being and adherence to regulatory requirements. By focusing on understanding the client's broader financial picture and risk tolerance, the professional ensures that any proposed actions are suitable and aligned with long-term goals, not just immediate emotional responses. This aligns with the regulatory principle of acting in the client's best interest and conducting thorough suitability assessments before recommending any product or strategy. It also upholds the ethical duty of care and diligence. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately executing the client's request without further investigation. This fails to meet the regulatory requirement for suitability and due diligence. It prioritizes client satisfaction over prudent financial advice and could lead to inappropriate investments that do not align with the client's risk tolerance or long-term objectives, potentially causing financial harm and violating regulatory standards. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's concerns outright and refuse to discuss any options. This demonstrates a lack of empathy and a failure to engage with the client's stated needs, even if those needs are based on a misunderstanding. Ethically, it breaches the duty to provide advice and support. From a regulatory perspective, it could be seen as a failure to adequately assess the client's situation and provide appropriate guidance, potentially leading to a complaint. A third incorrect approach is to focus solely on the potential for immediate gains without considering the associated risks or the client's capacity to absorb losses. This is a direct contravention of suitability rules, which mandate that recommendations must be appropriate for the client's circumstances, including their risk tolerance and financial capacity. It also ignores the ethical obligation to be transparent about risks. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured decision-making process that begins with active listening and empathy to understand the client's situation and emotional state. This should be followed by a thorough fact-finding process to gather all relevant information about their financial situation, objectives, and risk tolerance. Recommendations should then be developed based on this comprehensive understanding, ensuring they are suitable and compliant with all applicable regulations. Transparency about risks and potential outcomes is paramount, and professionals must be prepared to educate clients and guide them towards informed decisions, even when those decisions differ from their initial impulses. Question 7. Governance review demonstrates that a financial advisor has identified an investment product that aligns with a client's stated long-term growth objectives and moderate risk tolerance. However, this product carries a significantly higher commission for the firm compared to other suitable alternatives. The advisor is aware of this disparity. Which approach best reflects professional decision-making in this situation? Option A. Recommend the product with the higher commission, ensuring the client's stated objectives are met, and document the rationale for suitability. Option B. Decline to recommend the product due to the higher commission, even if it is the most suitable option for the client, to avoid any perception of conflict. Option C. Conduct a thorough, independent analysis of the product's suitability for the client, comparing it against all other viable alternatives, and transparently disclose any commission differences to the client before making a recommendation. Option D. Recommend the product based on the firm's offering, assuming it is inherently suitable, and proceed with the sale to meet firm revenue targets. The correct answer is A. Recommend the product with the higher commission, ensuring the client's stated objectives are met, and document the rationale for suitability. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a financial advisor must balance client interests with the firm's internal policies and potential conflicts of interest. Advisor has identified a product that aligns with the client's stated goals, but also offers a higher commission to the firm. Navigating this requires a robust decision-making framework that prioritizes client welfare while adhering to regulatory obligations and ethical standards. The pressure to meet sales targets or generate revenue can create a bias, making objective evaluation critical. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented assessment of the product's suitability for the client, independent of the commission structure. This means verifying that the product genuinely meets the client's risk tolerance, investment objectives, and financial situation. It requires considering alternative products that might offer similar benefits with lower costs or fees, even if they are less lucrative for the firm. This aligns with the fundamental regulatory and ethical duty of care, often enshrined in principles like best interests of the client or fiduciary duty, which mandate that client needs supersede firm profitability when there is a conflict. Transparency about the commission structure and any potential conflicts of interest is also paramount. Incorrect approaches analysis. One incorrect approach involves prioritizing the higher commission product solely because it benefits the firm, without a rigorous independent assessment of its suitability for the client. This represents a failure of the duty of care, and potentially a breach of conduct rules that prohibit prioritizing firm interests over client interests. It could be construed as a conflict of interest that has not been properly managed or disclosed. Another incorrect approach is to recommend the product based on a superficial review, assuming that because it's offered by the firm, it must be suitable. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to act with professional skepticism. It neglects the advisor's responsibility to critically evaluate all investment options for the client, regardless of internal offerings. This can lead to mis-selling and regulatory sanctions. A third incorrect approach is to avoid recommending the product altogether due to the commission, even if it is genuinely the best option for the client. This is also a failure, as it prioritizes avoiding a perceived conflict over fulfilling the client's needs. The goal is not to avoid all products with commissions, but to ensure that the recommendation is driven by client benefit, with full transparency about any associated costs or incentives. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the client's needs and objectives. This should be followed by a comprehensive research and analysis phase, where all suitable products are evaluated objectively, considering factors like performance, risk, fees, and alignment with client goals. Any potential conflicts of interest, such as commission structures, must be identified, disclosed, and managed. The final decision should be justifiable based on the client's best interests, with clear documentation supporting the recommendation. This process ensures compliance with regulatory requirements and upholds ethical standards. Question 8. Governance review demonstrates that a financial advisor who personally believes in a highly conservative investment strategy due to their own risk aversion is tasked with managing a client's portfolio. The client, however, has expressed a clear desire for higher-risk, growth-oriented investments to achieve their long-term financial goals. Advisor finds themselves in a position where their personal comfort level with risk directly conflicts with the client's stated objectives and the advisor's professional duty to act in the client's best interest. Option A. The advisor should prioritize the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance, seeking to understand the rationale behind the client's goals and recommending investments that align with those objectives, while clearly communicating the associated risks. Option B. The advisor should refuse to manage the client's portfolio, citing personal discomfort with the client's risk tolerance, without offering alternative solutions or referrals. Option C. The advisor should subtly steer the client towards more conservative options by downplaying the potential benefits of high-risk investments and emphasizing only the downsides. Option D. The advisor should implement their preferred conservative investment strategy, believing it is ultimately in the client's best interest to avoid potential losses, regardless of the client's stated preferences. The correct answer is A. The advisor should prioritize the client's stated objectives and risk tolerance, seeking to understand the rationale behind the client's goals and recommending investments that align with those objectives, while clearly communicating the associated risks. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where an individual's personal values and beliefs conflict with the established ethical guidelines and regulatory requirements of their profession. The challenge lies in navigating this conflict without compromising professional integrity, client interests, or regulatory compliance. The pressure to conform to personal beliefs while upholding professional duties necessitates a robust decision-making framework. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach prioritizes adherence to the regulatory framework and professional code of conduct. This aligns with the fundamental principle of professional responsibility, which mandates that individuals act in accordance with established laws, regulations, and ethical standards, even when they personally disagree. This approach ensures client protection, maintains public trust in the profession, and avoids legal or disciplinary repercussions. It demonstrates a commitment to objective decision-making, free from personal bias. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves allowing personal beliefs to override professional obligations. This is a direct violation of regulatory requirements and ethical codes, which are designed to ensure consistent, fair, and objective conduct. Such an approach could lead to discriminatory practices, breaches of confidentiality, or decisions detrimental to clients, resulting in disciplinary action, reputational damage, and potential legal liability. Another incorrect approach is to seek loopholes or justification to circumvent professional duties based on personal convictions. This demonstrates a lack of integrity and a disregard for the spirit of the regulations. Professionals are expected to uphold the integrity of their profession, not to undermine it through self-serving interpretations. This can lead to a loss of trust from clients, colleagues, and regulatory bodies. A further incorrect approach is to remain passive and avoid making a decision, hoping the conflict resolves itself. This inaction is also a failure of professional duty. Professionals are expected to make timely and informed decisions within their scope of responsibility. Indecision in the face of a conflict can lead to negative consequences for clients or the firm, and can be interpreted as an abdication of responsibility, potentially incurring disciplinary measures. Professional reasoning. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making process when faced with ethical dilemmas. This typically involves 1. Identifying the ethical issue and relevant stakeholders. 2. Consulting the applicable regulatory framework, professional code of conduct, and internal policies. 3. Evaluating alternative courses of action against these guidelines. 4. Seeking advice from supervisors, ethics committees, or legal counsel if the situation is complex or unclear. 5. Making a decision that is justifiable, defensible, and aligns with professional standards. 6. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale. Question 9. The audit findings indicate a pattern of inconsistent client onboarding procedures across different business units, leading to potential regulatory breaches related to Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) regulations. Management is pressing for an immediate resolution to satisfy regulatory scrutiny. Which approach best addresses this situation? Option A. Focus solely on disciplinary actions for individuals found to be non-compliant with existing, albeit inconsistent, procedures to deter future breaches. Option B. Develop a new comprehensive digital onboarding platform that automates all KYC/AML checks and deploy it across the firm within the next quarter, assuming it will resolve all procedural inconsistencies. Option C. Implement a standardized, firm-wide client onboarding checklist and conduct mandatory training for all staff involved in onboarding, followed by a review of the effectiveness of the new procedures within 3 months. Option D. Issue a directive to each business unit to immediately review and update their existing onboarding procedures to align with the most stringent interpretation of current KYC/AML regulations, without further central guidance. The correct answer is C. Implement a standardized, firm-wide client onboarding checklist and conduct mandatory training for all staff involved in onboarding, followed by a review of the effectiveness of the new procedures within 3 months. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate need to address audit findings with the potential for unintended consequences of a hasty decision. The pressure to demonstrate responsiveness to regulators can lead to shortcuts in the decision-making process. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the chosen course of action is not only compliant, but also effective and sustainable. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the root cause of the audit findings before implementing solutions. This aligns with regulatory expectations for robust risk management and internal control systems. By involving relevant stakeholders and considering multiple perspectives, the firm ensures that the proposed actions are well-informed, practical, and likely to prevent recurrence. This proactive and systematic approach demonstrates a commitment to compliance and ethical conduct, fostering trust with regulators and clients. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on superficial fixes without understanding the underlying issues fails to address the systemic weaknesses identified by the audit. This could lead to repeated findings in future audits and potential regulatory sanctions for a lack of genuine remediation. Another incorrect approach that involves implementing solutions without consulting relevant departments or seeking expert advice risks creating new problems or overlooking critical operational impacts. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and can result in inefficient or ineffective controls, potentially violating regulatory requirements for adequate supervision and operational integrity. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over accuracy, leading to the implementation of unverified or poorly designed solutions, exposes the firm to significant compliance and operational risks. This can be seen as a failure to act with due care and diligence, which are fundamental ethical and regulatory obligations. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with a clear definition of the problem, the audit findings. This should be followed by gathering comprehensive information, identifying potential causes, brainstorming a range of solutions, evaluating the feasibility and impact of each solution, selecting the most appropriate course of action, implementing it, and finally, monitoring its effectiveness. This iterative process ensures that decisions are data-driven, well-considered, and aligned with both regulatory requirements and business objectives. Question 10. System analysis indicates that a proposed process optimization for client onboarding aims to significantly reduce the time taken to gather necessary documentation. However, this optimization involves digitizing and storing client information in a new cloud-based system that has not yet undergone a full compliance audit against the specific regulatory requirements for data handling and client communication protocols. The team is eager to implement this change to improve efficiency. What is the most appropriate course of action for the professional responsible for overseeing this process optimization? Option A. Proceed with the implementation of the optimized process immediately, as the efficiency gains are substantial and the new system is generally considered secure, with a plan to conduct the compliance audit post-implementation. Option B. Halt the implementation of the optimized process until a comprehensive compliance audit of the new cloud-based system is completed, ensuring it fully meets all regulatory requirements for data handling and client communication, and that the optimization does not negatively impact client service standards. Option C. Delegate the responsibility of the compliance audit to the IT department and proceed with the implementation based on their preliminary assessment of the system's security. Option D. Implement the optimized process but with a temporary manual override for sensitive client data to ensure compliance, while the audit is pending, accepting a slight reduction in the overall efficiency gains. The correct answer is A. Proceed with the implementation of the optimized process immediately, as the efficiency gains are substantial and the new system is generally considered secure, with a plan to conduct the compliance audit post-implementation. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a common challenge in process optimization, where a seemingly efficient solution might overlook critical compliance and client welfare aspects. The professional is tasked with improving a process that directly impacts client outcomes, requiring a balance between operational efficiency and adherence to regulatory standards. The challenge lies in identifying potential unintended consequences of a proposed change that could lead to regulatory breaches or negatively affect client service, even if it appears to streamline operations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that efficiency gains do not compromise the integrity of client interactions or violate established guidelines. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the proposed process optimization against all relevant regulatory frameworks and client service guidelines. This includes assessing how the change might impact data privacy, client communication protocols, and the overall client experience. By prioritizing a comprehensive impact assessment that explicitly considers regulatory compliance and client welfare, the professional demonstrates adherence to the core principles of responsible practice. This proactive approach ensures that any optimization efforts are not only efficient, but also ethically sound and legally compliant, safeguarding both the firm and its clients. This aligns with the overarching duty of care and the requirement to act in the best interests of clients, as mandated by regulatory bodies. Incorrect approach is analysis. Implementing the change without a detailed review of its impact on client data handling and communication protocols is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This could lead to breaches of data protection laws, such as those requiring explicit consent for data processing or secure storage, and violate guidelines on client communication transparency. Prioritizing speed of implementation over a thorough risk assessment demonstrates a disregard for client welfare and regulatory obligations, potentially exposing the firm to fines and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to focus solely on cost reduction, without considering the qualitative impact on client service or the potential for increased errors due to a less robust process. This overlooks the ethical imperative to provide a high standard of service and could lead to client dissatisfaction and complaints, which themselves can trigger regulatory scrutiny. Finally, assuming that a process that works in one context will automatically be compliant in another without due diligence is a failure of professional judgment and a potential violation of the principle of know your client and know your obligations. Professional reasoning. Professionals facing process optimization decisions should adopt a structured decision-making framework. This begins with clearly defining the objectives of the optimization, followed by a comprehensive identification of all relevant stakeholders and their interests, including clients, regulators, and the firm. A critical step is to conduct a thorough risk assessment, evaluating potential operational, financial, regulatory, and ethical implications of any proposed changes. This assessment should involve consulting relevant regulatory guidance and legal advice where necessary. The decision should then be based on a holistic evaluation of the benefits versus the risks, with a strong emphasis on maintaining compliance and prioritizing client welfare. Continuous monitoring and review of implemented changes are also essential to ensure ongoing effectiveness and adherence to standards. Question 11. Process analysis reveals that a client is requesting a specific investment strategy based on recent market hype, but your internal risk assessment suggests this strategy carries a significantly higher risk profile than the client's stated risk tolerance. You have a limited time frame to respond to the client. Which of the following decision-making approaches best aligns with professional best practices and regulatory expectations? Option A. Present the client with a range of suitable investment options that align with their stated risk tolerance, explaining the pros and cons of each, and clearly articulating why the requested strategy may not be appropriate given their profile. Option B. Immediately implement the client's requested strategy, as their explicit instruction overrides any internal risk assessment, prioritizing client satisfaction. Option C. Advise the client that their requested strategy is too risky and refuse to proceed, without offering alternative solutions or further explanation. Option D. Proceed with the client's requested strategy, but include a disclaimer stating that the decision was made at the client's insistence, shifting all responsibility. The correct answer is A. Present the client with a range of suitable investment options that align with their stated risk tolerance, explaining the pros and cons of each, and clearly articulating why the requested strategy may not be appropriate given their profile. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing immediate client needs with the long-term implications of a decision, all within a regulated environment. The pressure to deliver a quick solution can sometimes overshadow the need for thorough due diligence and adherence to established decision-making frameworks. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the chosen path is not only effective in the short term, but also compliant and ethically sound. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, evidence-based decision-making process. This involves clearly defining the problem, gathering relevant information, evaluating potential solutions against established criteria, including regulatory compliance and ethical considerations, and then making a reasoned choice. This systematic method minimizes the risk of bias, ensures all relevant factors are considered, and provides a defensible rationale for the decision. In the context of financial advice, this aligns with the regulatory expectation of acting in the client's best interest and maintaining professional integrity. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's stated preference without exploring alternatives or assessing risks fails to meet the fiduciary duty. This can lead to unsuitable recommendations, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and violating regulations that mandate suitability and best interest assessments. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes speed over thoroughness, perhaps by making a decision based on incomplete information or assumptions, risks regulatory scrutiny and reputational damage. It demonstrates a lack of diligence and a failure to uphold professional standards. A third incorrect approach that relies on personal intuition or past experience without objective validation overlooks the need for a systematic and documented decision-making process, which is crucial for accountability and compliance. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that includes clearly identifying the objective and constraints, gathering and analyzing all relevant data, identifying and evaluating multiple options, assessing the risks and benefits of each option, selecting the option that best meets the objective while adhering to regulatory and ethical standards, and documenting the entire process. This structured approach ensures that decisions are well considered, justifiable, and in line with professional obligations. Question 12. Comparative studies suggest that effective decision-making and behavioral assessments hinges on a systematic approach. Imagine you are tasked with interpreting a candidate's behavioral profile using the PI behavioral test free practice guidelines. You encounter a set of results that present a complex interplay of traits, making a straightforward interpretation challenging. Which of the following approaches best aligns with the principles of the PI behavioral test free practice for navigating such ambiguity? Option A. Employing a structured framework that systematically analyzes the behavioral indicators against the established criteria within the PI behavioral test free practice, documenting the reasoning for each interpretation and the final decision. Option B. Seeking advice from colleagues who may not be familiar with the specific nuances of the PI behavioral test free practice, hoping for a consensus opinion. Option C. Prioritizing the speed of assessment by making an immediate judgment based on the most prominent behavioral traits, without delving into the nuances of the full profile. Option D. Relying on your extensive personal experience and intuition to quickly categorize the candidate's profile based on similar cases you've encountered in the past. The correct answer is A. Employing a structured framework that systematically analyzes the behavioral indicators against the established criteria within the PI behavioral test-free practice, documenting the reasoning for each interpretation and the final decision. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance competing priorities, adhering to a strict regulatory framework while also making a decision that could impact client outcomes. The challenge lies in interpreting and applying the PI behavioral test-free practice guidelines in a situation where the ideal behavioral response might not be immediately obvious or might conflict with other professional obligations. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the decision-making process itself is compliant and ethically sound, even if the outcome is not perfectly aligned with every theoretical behavioral model. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a structured, evidence-based decision-making framework that is explicitly or implicitly supported by the PI behavioral test-free practice guidelines. This involves a systematic evaluation of the situation, consideration of relevant behavioral indicators, and a reasoned justification for the chosen course of action. This methodical process ensures accountability, transparency, and adherence to the spirit and letter of the regulatory framework. It demonstrates a commitment to making informed decisions rather than relying on intuition or expediency. An incorrect approach that relies solely on personal intuition or past anecdotal experience without a structured framework fails to meet the standards of the PI behavioral test-free practice. This can lead to biased decision-making, inconsistency, and a lack of defensibility if the decision is later scrutinized. It bypasses the requirement for objective assessment and can result in overlooking critical behavioral indicators or misinterpreting their significance, potentially leading to regulatory breaches or ethical lapses. Another incorrect approach might involve prioritizing speed of decision-making over thoroughness. While efficiency is valued, the PI behavioral test-free practice emphasizes a deliberate and considered approach. Rushing a decision without adequate analysis increases the risk of error and can be seen as a failure to exercise due diligence, which is a cornerstone of professional conduct under such frameworks. A further incorrect approach could be to seek external validation or advice that is not aligned with the specific requirements of the PI behavioral test-free practice. While collaboration is often beneficial, relying on advice that does not adhere to the established guidelines of this particular framework can lead to decisions that are non-compliant, even if well-intentioned. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve 1. Understanding the core principles and requirements of the PI behavioral test-free practice. 2. Clearly defining the problem or decision to be made. 3. Gathering all relevant information and behavioral data. 4. Applying the structured decision-making framework prescribed or implied by the guidelines. 5. Evaluating potential courses of action against the framework's criteria. 6. Documenting the decision-making process and the rationale behind the final choice. 7. Reflecting on the outcome and refining the process for future situations. Question 13. Assessment of the potential impact of a new, complex investment product launch on the firm's existing client base and regulatory compliance framework, considering the absence of readily available quantitative performance data for the new product. Option A. Conduct a thorough qualitative assessment of the product's complexity, potential risks, and suitability for different client segments, alongside a review of the firm's compliance policies and staff training needs, to ensure alignment with regulatory obligations and client best interests. Option B. Delegate the entire impact assessment to the sales team, trusting their judgment on client suitability and regulatory adherence due to their direct client interaction. Option C. Proceed with the launch immediately, focusing primarily on the projected revenue streams and marketing opportunities, assuming existing client relationships can absorb the new offering. Option D. Delay the launch indefinitely until comprehensive historical performance data for the new product becomes available, even if this means missing a market opportunity. The correct answer is A. Conduct a thorough qualitative assessment of the product's complexity, potential risks, and suitability for different client segments, alongside a review of the firm's compliance policies and staff training needs, to ensure alignment with regulatory obligations and client best interests. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to assess the potential impact of a new product launch on their firm's existing client base and regulatory obligations without relying on quantitative data alone. The challenge lies in balancing commercial objectives with the fiduciary duty owed to clients and adherence to regulatory principles. Careful judgment is required to anticipate potential conflicts of interest, client suitability issues, and the firm's capacity to manage the new offering effectively. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a comprehensive, forward-looking assessment that considers all relevant stakeholders and regulatory requirements. This involves proactively identifying potential risks, evaluating the firm's preparedness, and ensuring that client interests remain paramount. This aligns with the core principles of conduct expected of financial professionals, emphasizing integrity, due diligence, and client protection, as mandated by regulatory frameworks that govern financial advice and product distribution. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the potential revenue generation fails to acknowledge the firm's regulatory obligations and fiduciary duties. This oversight can lead to breaches of conduct rules, such as those requiring suitability assessments and the avoidance of conflicts of interest, potentially resulting in regulatory sanctions and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach that neglects to consider the impact on existing client relationships overlooks the importance of client retention and the ethical obligation to act in their best interests. This can lead to client dissatisfaction, loss of trust, and potential complaints to regulatory bodies. A third incorrect approach that dismisses the need for internal training and resource allocation demonstrates a lack of foresight and preparedness. This can result in the firm being unable to adequately support the new product, leading to errors, mis-selling, and a failure to meet regulatory standards for product governance and oversight. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the firm's strategic objectives, then systematically evaluates the potential impact on clients, the firm's operational capacity, and all applicable regulatory requirements. This involves seeking input from relevant departments, e.g., compliance, legal, operations, conducting thorough risk assessments, and developing mitigation strategies before proceeding with any new initiative. The ultimate decision should be guided by whether the proposed action aligns with the firm's duty to act honestly, fairly, and professionally in accordance with the best interests of its clients. Question 14. When evaluating a request for potentially sensitive, non-public information from a client that could influence investment decisions, what is the most appropriate course of action to ensure compliance with regulatory frameworks and ethical conduct? Option A. Share the information only with a select few senior colleagues who are trusted to handle it responsibly. Option B. Ignore the request, as it is safer to avoid any potential regulatory scrutiny. Option C. Immediately share the information with the client, assuming their request is legitimate and for their benefit. Option D. Consult with the firm's compliance department to determine the appropriate handling of the information and seek guidance on whether it can be shared. The correct answer is C. Immediately share the information with the client, assuming their request is legitimate and for their benefit. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to balance the immediate need for information with the potential for that information to be misused or to create an unfair advantage. The core of the challenge lies in assessing the impact of sharing information that is not yet publicly disseminated, particularly in a context where market participants are expected to operate on a level playing field. Careful judgment is required to avoid actions that could be construed as market abuse or insider dealing, even if the intent is not malicious. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes adherence to regulatory requirements and ethical standards. By seeking clarification and guidance from the compliance department, the individual demonstrates a commitment to understanding and upholding the rules governing market conduct. This proactive step ensures that any action taken is in line with the firm's policies and relevant regulations, thereby mitigating the risk of regulatory breaches and maintaining market integrity. This aligns with the principles of fair dealing and transparency expected of all market professionals. An incorrect approach that involves sharing the information immediately without verification or consultation fails to consider the potential for market abuse. This could lead to a breach of regulations prohibiting the dissemination of non-public information that, if made public, could affect the price of a financial instrument. Another incorrect approach, which is to ignore the request for information entirely, might be overly cautious and could hinder legitimate business operations or client service if the information requested is, in fact, permissible to share under certain conditions. This demonstrates a lack of understanding of the nuances of information sharing protocols. A third incorrect approach, which is to share the information with a limited group of trusted colleagues without proper authorization, still carries significant risk. This selective dissemination can create an unfair advantage for those privy to the information and could be seen as a form of insider dealing, even if unintentional. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the nature of the information and its potential impact. This involves assessing whether the information is public or non-public material, and whether sharing it could create an unfair advantage or lead to market abuse. If there is any doubt, the next step should always be to consult with the compliance department or a designated supervisor to seek clarification and ensure all actions are compliant with regulatory obligations and internal policies. This systematic approach prioritizes integrity and risk management. Question 15. Quality control measures reveal a potential for subtle data drift in the automated scoring of PI behavioral assessments due to minor, unaddressed variations in input formatting over time. Which of the following represents the most responsible and compliant approach to address this finding? Option A. Attribute the data drift solely to human error in manual data entry and implement stricter manual entry protocols without investigating the automated scoring system itself. Option B. Immediately implement a new, more complex data aggregation software to process the scores, assuming it will automatically correct for any input variations. Option C. Acknowledge the findings but consider them minor and proceed with the current scoring process, focusing on increasing the speed of data entry. Option D. Conduct a thorough impact assessment of the identified data drift on the accuracy and validity of the assessment results, and develop a remediation plan to standardize input formatting and revalidate the scoring algorithm if necessary. The correct answer is D. Conduct a thorough impact assessment of the identified data drift on the accuracy and validity of the assessment results, and develop a remediation plan to standardize input formatting and revalidate the scoring algorithm if necessary. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficient data processing with the imperative to maintain data integrity and comply with regulatory requirements for accuracy and completeness. The pressure to deliver results quickly can lead to shortcuts that compromise quality. Professionals must exercise judgment to ensure that efficiency gains do not come at the expense of adherence to established standards and legal obligations. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a systematic review of the data processing methodology to identify potential points of failure or bias that could impact the accuracy of the behavioral assessment results. This aligns with the principles of robust quality control and the ethical obligation to ensure that assessments are reliable and valid. Specifically, it addresses the need to proactively identify and mitigate risks to data integrity, which is fundamental to the responsible use of behavioral assessments in any regulated environment. This approach demonstrates a commitment to due diligence and adherence to best practices in data management and assessment administration. Incorrect approach is analysis. One incorrect approach involves immediately implementing a new, untested data aggregation tool without a thorough impact assessment. This fails to consider the potential for the new tool to introduce errors, alter data interpretation, or violate data privacy regulations. It prioritizes speed over accuracy and compliance, which is a significant regulatory and ethical failure. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the quality control findings as minor anomalies and proceed with the existing process. This demonstrates a disregard for potential systemic issues that could invalidate the assessment results and mislead stakeholders. It represents a failure to uphold the duty of care and a potential breach of regulatory requirements concerning the accuracy and reliability of assessments. A further incorrect approach is to focus solely on the speed of data processing, assuming that any discrepancies are due to human error in manual entry rather than systemic issues. This overlooks the possibility that the data processing methodology itself is flawed, leading to inaccurate results. It fails to conduct a comprehensive root cause analysis, which is essential for effective quality control and regulatory compliance. Professional reasoning. Professionals should adopt a structured approach to impact assessment. This involves 1. Understanding the specific regulatory framework governing the assessment, e.g., data protection laws, professional conduct guidelines. 2. Identifying the potential impacts of any proposed changes or identified issues on data accuracy, integrity, and interpretability. 3. Evaluating the risks associated with each potential impact. 4. Developing mitigation strategies to address identified risks. 5. Documenting the assessment process and decisions. This systematic process ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and ethically sound, prioritizing the reliability and validity of the behavioral assessments. Question 16. Benchmark analysis indicates that a new investment product with potentially high returns, but also significant volatility, is about to be launched. As a financial advisor, you anticipate this product may be of interest to a portion of your client base. Before the official launch, you have access to preliminary prospectuses and market commentary, but a full impact assessment on diverse client portfolios is not yet feasible due to time constraints and the need for further client-specific data. What is the most appropriate course of action to ensure client best interests are met while adhering to regulatory guidelines? Option A. Proceed with recommending the product to clients who have previously expressed interest in high-risk investments, assuming it aligns with their general risk tolerance. Option B. Focus solely on the potential high returns of the product in client communications, downplaying the volatility and risks until further analysis can be completed. Option C. Advise clients to wait for the product to be fully established in the market and for more comprehensive performance data to become available before considering any investment. Option D. Initiate a preliminary impact assessment by reviewing available product information and market sentiment, identifying client segments that might be suitable, and preparing to communicate potential benefits, risks, and the need for personalized advice to clients. The correct answer is D. Initiate a preliminary impact assessment by reviewing available product information and market sentiment, identifying client segments that might be suitable, and preparing to communicate potential benefits, risks, and the need for personalized advice to clients. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires an individual to assess the potential impact of a new product launch on client portfolios without having complete, up-to-date information. The pressure to act quickly, coupled with the inherent uncertainty of market reactions, necessitates a structured and compliant approach. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for timely advice with the regulatory obligation to ensure that recommendations are suitable and based on adequate information. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, albeit time-constrained, impact assessment. This involves proactively gathering relevant information, considering various scenarios, and communicating potential risks and benefits transparently to clients. This aligns with regulatory principles that mandate suitability, client best interests, and appropriate risk management. By conducting this assessment, the professional demonstrates diligence and a commitment to providing informed advice, thereby upholding fiduciary duties and regulatory expectations. An incorrect approach that involves proceeding with recommendations without a proper impact assessment fails to meet the regulatory standard of care. This could lead to unsuitable recommendations, potentially causing financial harm to clients and exposing the professional to disciplinary action for breaches of conduct rules. Another incorrect approach, such as delaying any client communication until a perfect assessment is possible, might be seen as a failure to act in the client's best interest, especially if market opportunities are being missed due to inaction. This could also be viewed as a lack of proactive client management. A third incorrect approach, focusing solely on the product's potential upside without adequately considering downside risks, constitutes a misrepresentation and a failure to provide a balanced view, which is a direct violation of ethical and regulatory obligations to disclose all material information. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core regulatory and ethical obligations relevant to the situation. This involves understanding the duty to act in the client's best interest, the requirement for suitability, and the need for transparent communication. Next, they should assess the available information and identify any gaps. A risk-based approach should then be applied to determine the potential impact of the new product on different client segments. Finally, professionals must develop a communication strategy that clearly outlines potential benefits, risks, and any uncertainties, ensuring clients can make informed decisions. This structured process helps to navigate complex situations while maintaining compliance and ethical standards. Question 17. Upon reviewing a client's portfolio, you notice they have expressed a strong desire to invest a significant portion of their assets in a highly speculative, emerging market technology stock that has recently experienced extreme volatility. While the client is enthusiastic about the potential for rapid gains, your analysis indicates this investment carries substantial risk and is not aligned with their stated long-term financial goals of capital preservation and steady income generation. How should you proceed? Option A. Proceed with the investment as requested but briefly mention the risks without elaborating to fulfill disclosure requirements. Option B. Inform the client that their request is too risky and that you will not proceed with it, suggesting they seek advice elsewhere. Option C. Immediately execute the client's request to invest in the speculative stock, as their instructions are paramount. Option D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the rationale behind their interest in this specific stock. Explain the risks and potential downsides in relation to their stated goals, and present alternative investment strategies that offer growth potential with a more appropriate risk profile. The correct answer is D. Engage in a detailed discussion with the client to understand the rationale behind their interest in this specific stock. Explain the risks and potential downsides in relation to their stated goals, and present alternative investment strategies that offer growth potential with a more appropriate risk profile. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the potential for those preferences to lead to outcomes that are not in their best interest, particularly when considering the long-term implications of investment decisions. A professional must exercise careful judgment to balance client autonomy with their fiduciary duty to provide sound advice. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough understanding of the client's underlying financial goals and risk tolerance before making recommendations. This aligns with regulatory expectations that professionals act in the best interests of their clients, which often involves educating clients about the potential consequences of their choices and guiding them towards strategies that are more likely to achieve their objectives. This approach upholds the principles of suitability and client care mandated by regulatory frameworks. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on fulfilling the client's immediate, potentially ill-informed request without further inquiry fails to meet the professional's duty of care. This could lead to unsuitable recommendations, exposing the client to undue risk or suboptimal returns, and potentially violating regulations that require a comprehensive assessment of client needs and circumstances. Another incorrect approach that involves dismissing the client's request outright, without attempting to understand the rationale behind it, demonstrates a lack of client engagement and respect. This can damage the professional relationship and may also overlook valid, albeit perhaps poorly articulated, client concerns. It fails to foster trust and collaborative decision-making. A further incorrect approach that involves proceeding with the client's request while downplaying potential risks without a full and transparent discussion constitutes a failure of disclosure and potentially misrepresentation. This undermines the client's ability to make informed decisions and can lead to regulatory scrutiny for failing to provide adequate warnings and explanations. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve active listening to understand the client's stated desires, followed by probing questions to uncover the underlying motivations and objectives. A comprehensive assessment of the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment horizon is crucial. Based on this understanding, the professional should then present a range of suitable options, clearly explaining the potential benefits, risks, and long-term implications of each, including how they align with or diverge from the client's initial request. The goal is to empower the client to make an informed decision, with the professional acting as a trusted advisor guiding them towards the most appropriate path. Question 18. During the evaluation of a client's behavioral profile derived from a PI behavioral test, which approach best demonstrates professional responsibility and ethical conduct in tailoring service delivery? Option A. Utilize the behavioral insights to proactively adjust communication strategies and service delivery methods to better align with the client's likely preferences and potential risk factors, thereby enhancing engagement and mitigating misunderstandings. Option B. Disregard the PI behavioral test results entirely, considering them irrelevant to the provision of financial services and relying solely on traditional client profiling methods. Option C. Share the detailed behavioral profile with other team members and relevant departments to ensure a consistent approach without obtaining explicit client consent for such disclosure. Option D. Immediately flag the client as high risk for all future interactions based on any identified behavioral traits that suggest potential difficulties, without further investigation or consideration of context. The correct answer is A. Utilize the behavioral insights to proactively adjust communication strategies and service delivery methods to better align with the client's likely preferences and potential risk factors, thereby enhancing engagement and mitigating misunderstandings. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need to understand a client's behavioral tendencies, as revealed by the PI assessment, with the ethical obligation to use this information responsibly and without prejudice. The challenge lies in interpreting the behavioral data in a way that informs appropriate client interaction and service delivery, rather than leading to assumptions or discriminatory practices. Careful judgment is required to ensure the assessment's insights are applied constructively and in compliance with regulatory expectations regarding client treatment and data privacy. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it focuses on using the PI assessment results to enhance understanding of the client's communication preferences and potential risk factors, thereby enabling more tailored and effective service. This aligns with the principles of client-centric service and responsible data utilization. By seeking to understand how the client's behaviors might influence their engagement with financial advice or services, a professional can proactively adapt their communication style and service delivery to better meet the client's needs and mitigate potential misunderstandings or risks. This proactive and adaptive strategy is ethically sound and promotes a stronger client relationship. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's perceived risk based on behavioral traits, without further context or a balanced assessment, fails to uphold professional standards. It risks stereotyping the client and could lead to biased treatment, which is ethically unacceptable and potentially violates regulations that prohibit discrimination. Another incorrect approach that dismisses the PI assessment entirely, despite its potential to offer valuable insights into client behavior, represents a missed opportunity to improve service delivery and may indicate a lack of commitment to understanding client needs. This can lead to a less effective client relationship and potentially suboptimal advice. A third incorrect approach that involves sharing the PI assessment results with unauthorized third parties without explicit client consent would be a clear breach of data privacy regulations and ethical confidentiality obligations. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes understanding the client holistically. This involves using assessment tools like the PI behavioral test as one component of a broader client profile, alongside direct communication and observation. The focus should always be on how the insights gained can be used to improve service delivery and client outcomes, while rigorously adhering to all applicable data protection and anti-discrimination regulations. The process should involve critical self-reflection to avoid personal biases, influencing the interpretation and application of the assessment data. Question 19. Market research demonstrates that clients often express strong preferences for specific investment products they have heard about, even if those products carry a high degree of risk. A financial advisor has a client who is insistent on investing a significant portion of their portfolio in a newly launched, highly speculative technology fund, citing its perceived potential for rapid growth. The advisor, based on preliminary knowledge, believes this fund is significantly outside the client's stated risk tolerance and financial capacity to absorb potential losses. What is the most appropriate next step for the advisor to take? Option A. Inform the client that the fund is too risky and that the advisor cannot recommend it, but offer no further explanation or alternative suggestions, leaving the client to make their own decision. Option B. Immediately advise the client that the fund is too risky and suggest a completely different low-risk investment that the advisor believes the client would be more comfortable with, without further discussion of the original fund. Option C. Conduct a detailed impact assessment of the speculative fund against the client's specific financial situation, risk profile, and investment objectives, and then present the findings and suitable alternatives to the client. Option D. Proceed with the investment as requested by the client, as their explicit instruction overrides the advisor's personal concerns about risk. The correct answer is C. Conduct a detailed impact assessment of the speculative fund against the client's specific financial situation, risk profile, and investment objectives, and then present the findings and suitable alternatives to the client. Explanation. Scenario analysis. This scenario presents a professional challenge where a financial advisor must balance client relationships with regulatory obligations. The client's expressed desire for a specific investment, despite its high risk and potential unsuitability, creates a conflict. The advisor's duty of care and fiduciary responsibility, as mandated by regulatory frameworks governing financial advice, requires them to act in the client's best interest, even if it means disagreeing with the client's preference. The challenge lies in delivering this difficult message professionally and ethically, ensuring the client understands the rationale without damaging the relationship. Correct approach analysis. The correct approach involves a thorough impact assessment that prioritizes the client's best interests and adheres to regulatory requirements. This means conducting a comprehensive analysis of the investment suitability based on the client's financial situation, risk tolerance, and investment objectives. The advisor must then clearly communicate the findings, explaining the potential negative impacts of the high-risk investment and offering suitable alternatives. This aligns with the regulatory duty to provide advice that is in the client's best interest, as emphasized by principles of client protection and suitability, which are core tenets of financial advisory regulations. Ethically, it upholds the principle of acting with integrity and competence. Incorrect approaches analysis. Proceeding with the client's preferred investment without a thorough impact assessment and suitability analysis would be a significant regulatory and ethical failure. This bypasses the fundamental requirement to ensure investments are appropriate for the client, potentially leading to significant financial harm and regulatory breaches related to suitability rules. Recommending a different, equally high-risk investment that the advisor believes the client might prefer, without a proper assessment, is also problematic. While it attempts to steer the client away from their initial choice, it still risks placing the client in an unsuitable position and fails to demonstrate a robust impact assessment process. This could be seen as a failure to act in the client's best interest and a lack of due diligence. Simply refusing to discuss the investment without providing a clear, reasoned explanation based on an impact assessment is unprofessional and could damage the client relationship unnecessarily. While the advisor may be correct in their assessment, the lack of transparent communication and justification fails to meet the ethical standard of providing clear and understandable advice, and could be interpreted as a failure to adequately engage with the client's stated objectives. Professional reasoning. Professionals in this field should adopt a structured decision-making process. First, always prioritize understanding the client's stated needs and objectives. Second, conduct a rigorous documented assessment of any proposed course of action, focusing on its suitability and potential impact, guided by regulatory requirements. Third, communicate findings clearly and transparently to the client, explaining the rationale behind recommendations or concerns. Fourth, be prepared to offer alternative, suitable solutions. Finally, maintain thorough records of all assessments, communications, and decisions to demonstrate compliance and professional conduct. Question 20. Consider a scenario where a client who has recently experienced a significant market downturn expresses a strong desire to liquidate all their investments and move their entire portfolio into cash, citing fear and a need for absolute security. The advisor has reviewed the client's long-term financial plan, which includes retirement goals achievable only with continued market participation. Option A. The advisor should suggest a partial liquidation to cash but recommend keeping a significant portion invested, without thoroughly exploring the client's underlying fears or the long-term impact of even a partial shift. Option B. The advisor should immediately execute the client's request to move all assets into cash to alleviate their immediate anxiety and demonstrate responsiveness to their expressed wishes. Option C. The advisor should dismiss the client's concerns as irrational and insist that they stick to the original investment plan without any changes, emphasizing the historical performance of the market. Option D. The advisor should explain the potential long-term consequences of moving to cash, such as inflation erosion and missed recovery opportunities, while also acknowledging the client's fear and exploring strategies to manage risk within their existing diversified portfolio, such as rebalancing or adjusting asset allocation to a more conservative mix that still allows for growth. The correct answer is D. The advisor should explain the potential long-term consequences of moving to cash, such as inflation erosion and missed recovery opportunities, while also acknowledging the client's fear and exploring strategies to manage risk within their existing diversified portfolio, such as rebalancing or adjusting asset allocation to a more conservative mix that still allows for growth. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the potential for those preferences to lead to suboptimal or even detrimental outcomes, particularly when those preferences are driven by emotional responses rather than objective analysis. The advisor must navigate this delicate balance, upholding their fiduciary duty while respecting client autonomy. Careful judgment is required to discern when to guide and when to defer. The correct approach represents best professional practice because it prioritizes a thorough, objective assessment of the client's situation and goals before making recommendations. This aligns with regulatory frameworks that mandate suitability and a client-centric approach, ensuring that advice is tailored to the client's individual circumstances, risk tolerance, and financial objectives. It demonstrates a commitment to acting in the client's best interest, cornerstone of ethical conduct and regulatory compliance. This approach involves active listening, probing questions, and a commitment to educating the client about the implications of various choices, fostering informed decision-making. An incorrect approach that solely focuses on appeasing the client's immediate emotional reaction, without a deeper analysis of the underlying financial implications, fails to meet the standard of care. This could lead to recommendations that are not suitable, potentially exposing the client to undue risk or missing opportunities for growth, thereby violating regulatory requirements for suitability and fiduciary responsibility. Another incorrect approach that dismisses the client's concerns outright, without attempting to understand their perspective or provide reasoned explanations, demonstrates a lack of empathy and professionalism. This can erode trust and may also lead to non-compliant advice if the client's underlying concerns are valid but unaddressed. A third incorrect approach that prioritizes the advisor's own convenience or a quick resolution over a comprehensive client assessment risks overlooking critical factors, potentially resulting in unsuitable recommendations and a breach of professional duty. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's stated needs and concerns. This is followed by an objective assessment of their financial situation, risk tolerance, and long-term goals. The advisor then uses this information to develop and present suitable recommendations, clearly explaining the rationale, potential benefits, and risks associated with each option. Crucially, this process involves ongoing dialogue, allowing the client to ask questions and express any reservations, ensuring they are empowered to make informed decisions in alignment with their best interests.